In aviation, it's standard procedure. When a plane is lost, you salvage what you can. The galley oven, a piece of the landing gear, a light bulb from the instrument panel, the very one that was lit in the final moments. They say metal has no soul. It doesn't remember the final blow, harbors no despair. But what if a disaster is so sudden, the horror so immense, that its imprint is seared into the very material itself? When the fragments of a plane become not just spare parts, but relics of a tragedy. In December of '72, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 went down in the Everglades. And while the official investigation looked for answers in mechanics and human error, parts of the shattered liner began their second life on other planes. Soon, the crews and passengers on those flights started noticing something strange. Silent figures in the aisles, faces reflected where no one should be, voices that sounded like a warning. This isn't a story about a curse. It's a story about a duty that doesn't end with death, and a plane that refused to die alone. Hello, everyone. I'm kicking off a new series of material based on topics you've suggested. We'll once again be diving into the world of stories tied to cursed or possessed items, objects, and events. And I wanted to start with an urban legend recommended by one of our listeners. When I started digging into it, I found it was incredibly rich in detail, with a ton of fascinating facts that I'm excited to share with you. Unfortunately, at the heart of this legend is a real tragedy that occurred several decades ago, but it's the events that followed that gave birth to this paranormal phenomenon. I'm talking about the urban legend known as the ghosts of Flight 401. It all began in December 1972 with a plane crash in Florida, in the swamplands of the Everglades. The story really took off when the surviving parts from the wreckage were used to repair other aircraft. According to the legend, the monstrous force of the impact and the sheer tragedy of the crash had turned these salvaged components into cursed artifacts. In other words, they became harbingers of doom, and the planes they were later installed on began to be visited by the ghosts of some who had died in that wreck. But I'll get into all that in a few minutes. First, out of respect for the victims, I'll lay out the backstory of the crash itself. This tragic event occurred on December 29, 1972. You're looking at a photo now of that very liner, Eastern Airlines Flight 401. It was flying toward the Everglades and had practically reached its destination, but it was during the landing procedure that the catastrophe struck, giving rise to this urban legend. The causes of the crash were thoroughly analyzed and studied, which later led to changes in landing procedures. The gist of what happened, if we skip the complicated technical details which are not my forte as I'm no aviation expert, was this. The aircraft was being operated by 2 pilots and a flight engineer. These 3 were responsible for landing the plane safely. They were making sure that all the necessary procedures were followed during the approach and that everything was going according to plan. In the cockpit were First Officer Albert John Stockstill, Second Officer Donald Lewis Repo, who also served as flight engineer and was known as Don, and finally, the captain, Bob Loft. You can see their photographs. During the landing procedure, something strange happened. An error light on the instrument panel lit up, a signal telling the pilots that the nose landing gear hadn't deployed properly. It hadn't locked into the down position. It was clear the malfunction had to be fixed. And so, they set about fixing it. Here again, I have to touch on technical matters, but from what I've read, this is how things unfolded. While the pilots were troubleshooting the problem, they put the plane on altitude hold. Think of it as the aviation equivalent of cruise control. You can imagine cruise control in a car. When you activate it, you can take your foot off the gas, and the car will maintain the speed you set. What's more, in cruise control, you can increase or decrease the speed to new settings, and the system will hold them steady. So, you don't have to disengage cruise control to speed up or slow down to a new level. That same principle, but for flight, was used here. The plane was put on altitude hold while the crew tried to sort out the problem. But here's what happened. One of the pilots, it seems, accidentally bumped the control column or some other lever, causing the plane, instead of staying at its set altitude, to begin to descend. And because it was on an automatic hold setting, which registered this descent as a new command, it just kept going down. The system didn't flag an error because it was doing exactly what it was told. Because of this, the descent was very gradual and almost unnoticeable. The crew, remember, had no intention of landing at that moment, which is why they engaged the autopilot, to let the plane circle the airport while they bought time to fix the malfunction. But they never noticed the plane was sinking, slowly, ever so slowly, much lower than the altitude where they thought it should be. By the time the discrepancy was finally noticed, it was far too late. It's reported that Stockstill was the first to sense something was wrong. According to the cockpit voice recorder, he said, "We did something to the altitude." To which Loft asked, "What?" Stockstill clarified, "We're still at 2,000 feet, right?" And then Loft exclaimed, "Hey, what's happening here?" In less than 10 seconds, the crew would have undoubtedly realized that the plane was significantly below a safe altitude. In fact, it was flying straight into the ground, because 10 seconds later, it slammed into the Everglades at 227 miles per hour. It just plummeted into the ground at full speed. Think about your average car crash. Speeds vary, of course, but on average, it's around 60-80 miles per hour. Now imagine a collision at 227 miles per hour in a machine many, many times more massive than a car. One can only imagine what happened in that final moment. I hope I've explained that correctly. The information was quite technical, from a world I'm not too familiar with, but that's my understanding of it. And so, when the error was caught, it was already too late. This terrible tragedy occurred. The plane hit the swampy ground of the Everglades at 227 miles per hour. And what's astonishing is that even after such a monstrous impact, there were survivors. Yes, there were still living people on that plane. Of the 163 passengers, 69 survived. What's more, 8 flight attendants also made it out. In total, out of the entire crew and passengers, numbering, I don't recall exactly, a little over 200, 101 people lost their lives, which, in itself, is a miracle. The reason for this is thought to be the terrain. As hard as it is to believe, the Everglades swamp, even in a 227-mile-per-hour collision, cushioned the impact. The soft ground absorbed some of the energy, which saved lives. Furthermore, there's a theory that the mud itself may have prevented people from bleeding to death, as it instantly packed the wounds the survivors sustained in the crash. So, as incredible as it sounds, even in a full-blown catastrophe, with a plane crashing straight into the ground, there were survivors. After the crash, it was decided that some parts of the plane could be salvaged. This always happens. When a major piece of machinery fails, one of the first things a company does is determine if any parts can be reused, to be stripped and applied to other machines or departments. It's standard practice. The cruise liner that capsized off the coast of Italy comes to mind. When that happened, the ship was obviously written off, but it was repaired just enough so that the surviving parts could be stripped from it. The same thing happened with this plane. And here is where the urban legend truly begins. Because of what happened during the crash, because of the tragedy and the suddenness of it all, especially for the pilots, The souls of Captain Bob Loft and engineer Don Repo had, apparently, become attached to these salvaged parts. The company, as mentioned, stripped these parts from the wrecked plane and used them as components on other airliners. But unfortunately, and unbeknownst to anyone at the time, these parts had become, you could say, cursed, because they brought the ghosts of Bob Loft and Don Repo with them. Here's what eyewitnesses who encountered these phenomena had to say. Reports came in of these men just appearing out of thin air. Crew members and passengers would recognize them, realizing they were the deceased pilots, and wonder, what is that man doing here? The ghosts would appear right in the cabin of the plane. For instance, Repo appeared to one of the captains and told him directly, "There will never be another crash. We will not let it happen." After which, he vanished. Another incident involved a female passenger who was sitting next to a man. He caught her attention because he looked so pale and sick. He didn't speak, even when the woman may have tried to strike up a conversation. But when a flight attendant approached, likely to offer the gentleman a drink or something, the man suddenly vanished, and the description matched one of the very pilots from the downed flight. One moment he was sitting in his seat, not speaking to anyone, and the next, he had evaporated before their very eyes. Then there was another incident on a different plane, one that had been fitted with some of that salvaged hardware. The story goes that one of the pilots materialized right in front of the crew and pointed to a specific spot on the plane, as if to say, "Something's wrong with this part, right here. You need to fix it." The people who witnessed this were floored. He just appeared out of thin air, pointed out the problem, and then vanished. And that was just one more case in a string of them. And here's a fascinating tidbit about this whole urban legend. Eastern Airlines, getting bombarded with all these reports of ghosts, phantoms, you name it, was, to put it mildly, not happy. In fact, they threatened to sue the author of a book that was coming out at the time, John G. Fuller, who wrote The Ghost of Flight 401. He had pieced together all these stories and was about to publish a book on the whole affair. But Eastern Airlines slapped him with a lawsuit threat to try and block the publication. Maybe they thought it was all a bunch of baloney that would tarnish their airline's reputation. Or maybe they were trying to shield the victims' families, to stop anyone from cashing in on the tragedy. Or perhaps it was a mix of both. Or maybe they had some other motive entirely for trying to get this lawsuit off the ground. In the end, though, they never actually made it to court because their suit got tossed out by the Florida 4th District Court of Appeal, likely on free speech grounds, which, when it comes to publishing books, is pretty much ironclad. You can write a book about almost anything, so winning a case to block its publication is a really, really tough hill to climb. Still, some family members of one of the pilots, Loft, did sue the author themselves, claiming invasion of privacy and intentional infliction of emotional distress on his grieving widow, and, of course, his son and daughter. But they lost their case too. So, those are just some of the stories tied to the ghosts, or the curse, of Flight 401, and it all goes back to the idea that those salvaged parts, because of the sheer force of the impact and the suddenness of the crash, had somehow absorbed the shock and terror of the lost souls. And when these parts were scattered across other planes, which, again, is standard practice for airlines trying to cut costs, you don't let a single scrap of metal or a perfectly good screw go to waste. They carried the curse, or this string of hauntings, with them. Nothing truly malicious, mind you. I tried to dig up any reports of these ghosts doing anything harmful, but I came up empty. Still, it got to the point where Eastern Airlines finally took drastic action. They stripped every last one of those salvaged parts from their other planes and replace them with brand new ones. And that's the moment the hauntings, the curse, the apparitions, they all stopped. Dead. Not a single sighting was ever reported again. It's a chilling, fascinating story. What do you guys think? The ghosts of Flight 401. It's a relatively new urban legend as far as these things go, born from the tragedy of that 1972 crash and its aftermath. I hope I did a decent job of explaining how and why that crash happened. If anyone can explain it better, by all means, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if anyone knows of any other stories tied to these hauntings, these onboard apparitions. There's one more, in particular, about a flight attendant. The claim is that she saw the face of the flight engineer, Repo, staring back at her from inside a galley oven, and when he appeared, he warned her, saying, "Watch out for fire on this plane." And sure enough, that very plane started having engine trouble right after. But that warning, as they later discovered during inspection, is what saved the aircraft from crashing. Incredible stuff. So again, if any of you have similar stories connected to this specific urban legend, please, I would absolutely love to hear them. Leave your comments. Definitely share them down below. Thanks again, everyone. As always, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.